Good morning and welcome to day 3 of our second Real Estate Live UK in 2021. Our weeks of free to attend virtual events run 3 times a year in February, June and October, and the programme is brought to you by White Label, our partners and sponsors. And I'd like to offer a particular thank you to Fiera Real Estate UK, who are partnering with our Green Investment Keynote, which is about to take place. During the sessions this week, places across the UK are showcasing investment opportunities and discussing industry-leading topics about the what's new in the property sector and topical ideas related to property. So you can view the full programme of sessions taking place on our website, realestatelive.co.uk, and I'll let you know about what else is coming up today at the end of this session. Before we begin our Green Investment Keynote discussing how the real estate sector can achieve net zero carbon, I'd just like to remind the audience to please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A feature. I'm sure that'll be repeated throughout the session, but we're really keen to encourage your audience engagement. So please, even now, start putting your questions in there. And I'm now really pleased to hand over to our chair for this session, Sonal Jain, who's Director of Sustainability and Climate Leadership at JLL. So Sonal, over to you.
Good morning, all. So welcome to the Real Estate Live webinar on how can real estate achieve net zero carbon. Just reflecting on last 12 months, it is now firmly established that our economy must transition to net zero carbon no later than 2050. And there is an even higher urgency to decarbonize our emissions in the next 10 years, almost to a point where we are halfway there by 2030. So this is a hugely ambitious task. And what does it mean for real estate sector? I mean, firstly, with our sector accounting for 40% of the emissions, the need to transition our buildings is absolutely critical. Secondly, the ambition level within the sector is at all-time high. Just reflecting on some of the commitments that we are seeing coming through from the business community. I'll pick on the UN-backed Race to Zero campaign, which got launched this time last year. And within 12 months, there are over 4,500 organizations globally which are committed to net zero carbon. And within this campaign, real estate is one of the top 5 sectors in terms of number of signatories, so that we are no more like the laggards of the economy. And second, more locally, the landmark climate change commitment led by Better Buildings Partnership in 2019 saw 26 of leading UK landlords make the net zero carbon commitment, representing over 300 billions of assets under management. So it's great. And this brings me to my third point. If 2019 and 2020 were the years to set commitments, 2021 has to be the year to drive action. So this is what we want to focus on today. Some of the questions we want to look at is how can real estate sector drive action? What are the challenges we might encounter and how we might navigate these? So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our panel to help us unpack some of these questions. So we have today with us Jessica Pills. Jessica joins us from Fiera Real Estate, where her role is to champion their ESG strategy across the business. We have Melanie Leech. Melanie is the Chief Executive at British Property Federation, where her role is to champion a diverse, successful and a sustainable real estate sector. We have Oliver Light. Oliver joins us from Carbon Intelligence, where he leads on delivering ESG and net zero carbon advisory services to both landlords and tenants. And then we have our green finance specialist, Emma. Emma joins us from Green Finance Institute, where she leads a portfolio of initiatives, including the Coalition for Energy Efficiency of Buildings. And last but not least, we have Ian Morrison. Ian is Director of Policy and Evidence at Historic England. Ian's role is focused on ensuring England's historic environment is protected and championed for public benefit. So just a reminder again to our attendees, please actively use the Q&A function. After initial reflections from the panel, we'll open up and try and take as many questions as we can from the audience. So with that, I probably I'd perhaps ask Jessica for you to kind of help us set the scene on how UK property companies should approach or respond to this net zero carbon buildings agenda, and what opportunities they might have available to transition their buildings to net zero carbon within the timeline we are looking to achieve.
Great, thanks, Sonal. Got the slides. Great morning, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Sonal. As you mentioned, I'm just going to try set the scene in terms of why we're looking at net zero carbon within the real estate sector and how this can be achieved. So the impacts, you've touched on this a bit, Sonal, but it really goes without saying that climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. In 2018, the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued us with a stark warning that in order to meet the ambitions laid out in the Paris Agreement, we will need to limit the Earth's warming to 1.5 degrees in order to prevent the most sort of catastrophic events. And this led to the UK government declaring a climate emergency, and in 2019 became the first major economy to pass net zero emission law, which requires the country to bring all greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. The ambitions set out by the UK government really require urgent action from the real estate sector, particularly given its significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. In the UK, the operation of building accounts for 30% of total emissions, and the embodied emissions from the construction of new buildings can account for up to half of the carbon impacts associated with the building over its life cycle. Sonal already mentioned, but globally, the real estate sector is responsible for 40% of energy and process-related emissions. So what does net zero carbon actually mean, and how can this be achieved in the real estate sector? As I'm sure you've already seen, there are many definitions of net zero carbon across the real estate industry globally, and these are constantly being refined as organizations seek to agree the extent of impact and action required by the industry. But I'm going to use the UK Green Building Council's framework just to look at 3 commonly referred to definitions of net zero carbon. The first is net zero construction, where the carbon emissions from a building's product and construction stages are 0 or negative through reduction measures, use of high quality carbon offsets for residual emissions, and where the route taken is publicly disclosed at practical completion. The second is net zero ready, where net zero construction is achieved and operational energy or carbon performance is optimized, giving occupiers the opportunity to achieve net zero operation through appropriate renewable energy procurement. And lastly, net zero operation, where operational energy demand is minimized, heating is via low carbon sources, and on-site renewable energy generation is maximized. And then renewable energy is then procured to cover any residual grid energy demand, and the route again needs to be publicly disclosed annually. So how can we achieve net zero carbon, both operationally and through construction? First, and probably most importantly, is on-site renewable energy. Renewables will play a significant role in helping the UK meet its 2050 net zero targets. In 2019, half of the UK's electricity generation was from low carbon technologies, including renewables and nuclear. But in order to achieve net zero by 2050, the UK will need to quadruple its low carbon electricity generation. The UK must increase its total supply of renewable energy, renewable electricity, while simultaneously reducing demand on the electricity grid. A building powered from on-site renewable energy achieves both of these aims. Secondly, and I know Ian will touch on this in a little bit, but given that 80% of the building stock that will exist in 2050 has already been built, retrofitting is key to achieving net zero. The real estate sector needs to maximize the use of existing assets, optimize asset operation and management to reduce the extent of new construction required. Thirdly, tenant engagement. This is particularly true for portfolios where there is limited control over the asset from a landlord point of view. This is especially the case in a sort of a FRI, or fully repairing and insuring lease agreement situation. For us at Fiera Real Estate UK, tenant engagement is critical, given the limited control we have over our assets across our investment funds. So in this instance, fostering relationships with tenants and understanding their objectives when it comes to net zero and sustainability, and to work alongside them to achieve our shared target of 2050 is critical. We've conducted several tenant surveys to gauge our tenants' commitment to these areas. We've hosted ESG and net zero carbon focus groups, and implemented an automatic data harvesting project to collect our tenants' energy data to kind of relieve that burden on them to having to share that with us. And these relationships we build are imperative to delivering our net zero carbon pathway, which is currently being built by our net zero carbon pathway partner, Carbon Intelligence. And you'll hear from Ollie in a little bit about how we are working with our tenants. Next is just innovation and construction. So we really need to embrace technical innovation through modern methods of construction, use low carbon materials. We need to streamline delivery processes and minimize resource consumption. This can all save energy and costs. And finally, one point I really want to touch on, and I know that Melanie is going to draw on this in a bit more detail, but I believe that if we are to see real change, I don't believe net zero carbon or any other sort of ESG related factors should be used as a competitive advantage. I think we need to share our success in the space of net zero carbon to drive and influence change, particularly since this is a new concept that we are all adjusting to. So in closing, I just wanted to sort of end. I recently wrote an article about how we can't make any more excuses for not taking action. And I believe this to be very true. We may not have the most perfect or most consistent framework for addressing net zero carbon, but this shouldn't stop anyone from taking the steps needed to understand what this looks like for their assets and portfolios. There are sufficient and highly valuable frameworks that already exist and have been researched and evolved at length by credible organisations, such as the UK Green Building Council. I think if we stand still and sort of wait for everyone's definition of net zero carbon to be exactly the same, we may never solve the climate crisis. There's enough out there to help us take action now, and with more banks offering green money to fund projects to meet energy performance and other sustainability targets, we'll see the climate finance gap close. And I know that Emma will chat on that in a bit more. So that's really just hopefully helpful to set the scene. And I'd like to hand back to you now, Sonal. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. That was really useful to understand the various layers of net zero definition at operation, construction, and development stages, and the five solutions to consider with renewables, retrofit, engagement, innovation, and collaboration. I'm sure we'll touch upon various aspects of these as we go along. Just picking on tenant engagement, and I think you said this is going to be imperative to your net zero carbon pathway. Very, very true. And the language you used about that shared net zero goal. So it's really important to understand kind of how can we enable this brilliant collaboration. And I might invite you, Oliver, at this point, given you obviously see perspectives from both sides, both the landlords and tenants, and just to hear from you, what role do you think data sharing and measurement can play in delivery of net zero goals? And also, how important is tenant engagement in that process?
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks for having me this morning. It plays a really fundamental role. Tenant emissions can actually make a fund or an organisation, it can be double of your own emissions in your building. So it can be significant. I know that Jess and the Fiera team have done really well at better understanding that data and then looking for opportunities to collaborate with those occupiers to decarbonise those buildings. We're actually working with some high-profile names at the moment on the occupier side to set their own net zero targets, which means that they want much more clarity from their landlords around what they are looking to do to achieve net zero. And they are prepared to walk away from certain buildings if they cannot hit those criteria. Also think there's a major business case here. There's two reports that I've looked at. One is M&G and one's JLL, where they've both been able to provide a link between higher yields or premium rates from tenants by having a green building. So if you can get ahead of that curve, it's going to be really important. And equally, from a landlord perspective, from an asset manager perspective, you're future-proofing your asset in the future. You're not just going to get an asset back in 2-3 years' time or 10 years' time that's a brown asset and you can do very little of. And by that point, legislation would have moved so far forward, you're forfeiting a big discount rate or equally not being able to lease it to the next occupier. So I think that relationship is going to be essential, and those who get ahead of this curve are going to be the winners in the long term.
Thank you, Oliver. Really interesting point about getting ahead of the curve and ensuring we are reaping the benefit of early movers. I mean, obviously, not many. I mean, our industry is so diverse with like big players and smallers, and people don't have the resources and the skills to really get ahead of the curve. And I mean, this is where maybe, Melanie, your perspective as BPF's as an organization which represents the entire property industry in the UK, from very smaller SMEs to big, large listed entities. How confident that the industry feels they have everything to drive this change, or in fact, what support they actually need to be able to deliver on their net zero carbon goals?
Thank you, Sonal, and morning, everybody. It's great to be here. So I think probably the first thing to say is, that when you start to talk about support, you immediately think of government support, whether that's in the form of funding or other incentives. And in truth, there's relatively little direct government support in terms of grants or loans. There are sustainable retrofit funds available to local authorities and social housing providers. But to pick up a point that Jessica made, given that most of the housing stock that will be around in 2050 has already been built, and most of it is in private ownership, actually there's no financial support or incentives for private landlords or building owners to really take the measures they're going to need to take. And I don't think I need to rehearse the sort of the saga of the Green Homes Grant Scheme, but I think it's fair to say that we've got a way to go to design a scheme that would really fit that gap. Policy is important, and we've been calling for some time actually for government to set out a clearer roadmap and framework with targets and incentives for our sector alongside others, because it needs to be comprehensive clearly. But the truth of the matter is that the support for the real estate industry is primarily coming from the industry itself. I mean, again, picking up another point Jessica made, it's hugely important that we all work together and that this isn't competitive, this is collaborative. And bodies like the Better Buildings Partnership and the UK Green Building Council are really leading the way and trying to bring the industry together. And because not everybody needs to invent the answers to this. There are large companies, and Oliver's referenced a couple already, who've got more resource to put into this, who are ahead of the curve, and they can help the smaller companies, those who are behind the curve, and pull them through as well, because we all need to act together ultimately, and we all need to find a way forward that is going to be right for our own individual businesses. So it has to be, I think, around collaboration. There are great examples of that already. We've been involved in things like the UK Green Building Council's Net Zero Carbon Buildings Framework, work on energy use targets for offices, but we need to do much, much more. And one of the things that one of my team currently is seconded to the UK Green Building Council to work on at the moment is a UK GBC whole life carbon roadmap, which we're hoping will be launched at COP26 later this year. So that's really trying to say, what part does everybody need to play to take a collaborative whole supply chain approach to decarbonising the built environment? And that's going to need everyone to take action. That's going to need contractors to decarbonise building methods and materials, designers and engineers pushing their clients towards net zero carbon solutions and bringing their creativity to that challenge. Developers and owners targeting net zero portfolios, investors, as they increasingly are, demanding ESG credentials, being really clear about the types of projects they want to fund, and lenders asking borrowers, to deliver that and set out clear net zero plans and making products available which I know Emma will come on and talk about, that really incentivise and drive the behaviours we need to see. So collaboration, I think, and supporting each other, I think, is really the key message.
That's really useful, Melanie. And one message to take home: collaboration and supporting each other. And it also, on a positive note, it's shown that how quickly our industry can innovate ahead of regulation, which is so kind of counter to some of the old views that sits within the industry from outside. And the work UKGBC has done with the industry partners on the framework has been absolutely transformational. So I think a few of you, in fact, almost all of you, have touched upon existing buildings, the 29 million homes, the private ownership, the 80% of the stock that will still stay in 2050. So they just, we know in this net zero trajectory that we are setting off on, we must absolutely put our heads down on existing building. And you put the layer on top of that UK has one of the highest number of historic buildings anywhere in Europe. I kind of read it on Historic England's website last night. So, I mean, I can see, and you're nodding, and really over to you on from Historic England's point of view, what is your view on how important is to transition our historic buildings to net zero carbon standards? And then more importantly, how easy, or in fact, how challenging this is going to be.
Yeah, thanks, Sonal, and morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this event. Absolutely. As everyone else has said, it's absolutely fundamental that we address the existing building stock and including that in historic building stock. Just to pick up on your point, a fifth of all of our domestic buildings are over 100 years old, which is great. It's really sustainable, but clearly we're not going to achieve our net zero unless something is done to make them more energy efficient. And I'm quite happy to say that every building, no matter how historic, can be made more energy efficient. But how easy is it to do? The honest answer is not that easy. And at the moment, we're in danger of making it more difficult for us. And the reason for that is that buildings are complex, and therefore complex solutions are needed. And yet so much of our approach at the moment to climate change adaptation and energy efficiency is based on relatively simple solutions derived from evidence generated by new buildings, not historic ones. We particularly see this in the case of EPCs, energy performance certificates, for example, where our research, Historic English research, shows that energy use in a typical Victorian terrace house is around 40%, between 40 and 60% less than predicted by the standard assessment protocol. And therefore, it's really difficult to decide which retrofit measures to implement if we don't actually know how a building's performing. And the danger is that we could end up increasing carbon rather than reducing it, because any sort of retrofit measure brings a carbon footprint with it. So we need to invest in better research. We need to get better information so that we can make better decisions. And then we need to invest in skills and guidance to improve knowledge and practice across the spectrum. And that's with owners and occupiers, tenants, with local authority planning departments, and the construction sector and the supply chain. We need to reform the EPC framework, and we need to take a much wider look at appropriate policies and programmes, including funding, as Melanie said. So these are not just the views of me, of Historic England. They're all very clearly set out in the findings of the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee inquiry into the energy efficiency of existing homes, which was published earlier this year, back in March, I think. But most of all, we need to change our approach and mindset. So we simply cannot build our way out of climate change challenge. Recycling our existing buildings, as others have said, reduces carbon, it reduces waste, it reduces pressure on our finite natural resources. And with the right approach, we will produce the right results. So some research we undertook last year and published again earlier this year showed that with the right retrofit measures, our historic houses can reduce their carbon emissions by up to 84%, which is, really significant But within that, we need to think about small changes to people's actions, which can accumulate to make large differences to carbon emissions. So it's not just about retrofit, it's also about behavioural change. Repair and maintenance, absolutely vital for our low carbon future. There's no point putting wall insulation on a wet wall. It won't make any difference. In fact, it will make the problem worse, not better. Retrofit can reduce carbon in the long term if it's done properly, but it can also create significant amounts of emissions in the short term, which, as we all know, is called embodied carbon emissions. And we also need to consider the energy that we're going to be increasingly using to cool our buildings as well as to heat them, particularly as the country hots up. And that's something that we don't think is significantly enough considered in the current debate. So more thinking about what the whole use of energy is in our existing building stock. So just to sum up, I guess, retrofitting our existing buildings won't be easy, but it can and has to be done because ultimately, if we address our existing building stock, help them transition, we are going to make a significant dent in our or significant progress towards achieving net zero. And I'll just pick up on Melanie's point around collaboration here, if I can. We've actually been working with Grosvenor, the Crown Estate, National Trust, Peabody and others to look at producing or understanding the issues and producing a roadmap. And that's resulted in a publication which has been released this morning and which sets out some of this in more detail. And we recognise that learning from each other, working together collaboratively to find answers to these many challenges will help us along our journey. I'll post a link in the chat, so if people want to follow up. But thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Really helpful. And I wonder if you are also able to post the link to the report that looked at up to 80% reduction research, if it's publicly available. That would be useful for our audience as well. Really, really useful. I might actually kind of get a bit more insight into, there's some of the points you made where it's about delivering the right retrofit solutions and avoiding those unintended consequences. And maybe Oliver or Jessica, from the work you're doing, Jessica, in your case, your portfolio, or Oliver, across the client work, like what are some of those low-hanging retrofit solutions that are almost getting to a point where they are absolutely scalable and no-brainer for the industry to adopt?
Yeah, I mean, from my side, one of the first areas that you should look at is optimization. So when you go into a building, so many of these different buildings aren't actually optimized. They're running 24/7, kit's not managed in a particularly efficient manner. And then once you've done that, once you have this proof of concept where you've got this very quick return on investment, you can start to invest into, LEDs are commonly used. Equally, you can look at different replacement projects across your HVAC. So a big piece that we're now looking at is trying to remove gas from buildings, and that will really help to future-proof these assets. But it's being smart about it as well. So looking at when that replacement might be due, when the next refurbishment might be coming up, or when a tenant might be leaving a building, so that you can get in there and don't make similar mistakes. Rather think about what project is still going to be, what retrofit will still make sense in 10, 15 years time against any of your, against your pathway. So I would suggest if you focus on those quick wins, it can make a lot of sense. And then as you build that confidence and understanding of how to achieve net zero, you can look at some of the more expensive opportunities like facade optimization, and just thinking about how you can better manage heating and cooling throughout the year. So it's a tricky one with listed buildings, but one that it sounds like there's a lot of research through Ian and others to understand what they can do.
Great. Jessica, if I might come to you, one of the solutions in your opening slides were renewables. I mean, from an owner perspective, how feasible it has been to consider renewable solutions in Fiera's existing real estate portfolio?
Yeah, so we actually, it's a tricky one, like Ollie says, and I think the biggest challenge we have, which I drew on in my sort of introduction, was just around that lack of control that a landlord has potentially at an asset. So for us, what we leverage off of is very much tenant engagement. So we've actually recently done a full desktop analysis of our entire portfolio to understand where the renewable energy opportunities are, which buildings would benefit most from it. And then, as Ollie mentioned, now it's about drawing also on that like lease expiry profile, the sort of lease analysis across our portfolio to understand where those opportunities are to implement such features. So in terms of cost effectiveness, so another key area where the tenant engagement piece comes in is really around engaging with tenants, because we've actually had a couple of tenants approach us about wanting to do renewable energy at their property. So it's looking at ways that you can collaborate and look at how you can sort of do the funding together, looking at green finance options, because there is, it's become a lot more affordable recently, and the paybacks are much better than they were. And we've had a really great company called Push Energy look across our whole portfolio, and they've put together some really great analysis. And then it's also about working with our valuers to understand how we can look at that income stream from a capital value point of view, and working closely with them to understand how you can take that into account so that it actually works for us as an asset manager. So of course, it's probably not low-hanging fruit, but as I mentioned, renewables really are going to be one of the biggest solutions, and it's something that you need to consider, particularly if you are building a net zero carbon pathway. We can't just there's only so much you can offset, and I sort of am a firm believer that you need to do as much as you can before you even get to that route, and it should be like the last possible solution. So yeah, I think it's about looking at green finance, working with your tenants, and identifying those opportunities.
Great. Now that sounds fantastic, and actually perfectly segues into bringing Emma into the conversation. And in fact, Emma, there's a question which is very much in your arena, but which I'll say out in a minute. But more broadly, I think what will be really beneficial to hear from you is, what are some of the solutions that are available for homeowners or businesses to consider to help them overcome that initial investment case or barriers that is associated with upfront funding. And the question is specifically from the audience around what green funding is available for developers. So more kind of as I understand is it's non-residential financing solutions here. So over to you.
Thanks, Sonal. And I think you kind of touched on it in the question, which is that there isn't a magic green bullet that is going to fund all retrofits and all development of green low carbon properties in a single fell swoop. What we really need is there's a smorgasbord of different financial solutions that support different segments of the market and genuinely help to unlock the barriers that those different segments face to investing into net zero buildings. And this is exactly what the Green Finance Institute's Coalition for the Energy Efficiency of Buildings has been doing. We've been looking at the market to understand the unique and very real barriers that different households and property owners face, and then collaboratively with our 320 plus cross-sector membership, actively developing financial solutions that can help unlock those barriers. So I thought it'd be quite nice today to give a bit of a whistle-stop tour through what some of these solutions could look like. And I'll caveat that a lot of these are focused at the resi sector now, but our coalition will start looking at commercial buildings down the line. So the poster child of retrofit financing is the so-called green mortgage. And over the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen a real drive by the finance sector to launch more and more of these green mortgage products. Now, in short, a green mortgage is like a standard mortgage, but it can offer a financial incentive if the funds are put towards improving a property to be more energy efficient, or acquiring or constructing a highly energy efficient property. Now, when I was at Barclays, I led the launch of Barclays Green Home Mortgage, which offered a reduced interest rate if you purchased an energy efficient home. But we've seen recent offerings that can provide bespoke advice on how to improve your property or higher borrowing capacity. So we're really starting to see an explosion in this market. And the Green Finance Institute launched the Green Home Finance Principles, which is a set of process guidance around green mortgages to try and ensure that there is integrity and transparency in the market, really trying to avoid any accusations of greenwashing coming into this space. And we'll be launching a green mortgage hub quite soon, so you can have a look at some of the different products that are around. But we also know that there are some really fantastic solutions that have been piloted and championed abroad. One of the key ones that we hear all the time is something called property assessed clean energy finance, sometimes heard as PACE finance or property linked finance. Now, this has mobilized over $9 billion towards retrofitting in the US, and it can fund up to 100% of a retrofit's cost and is repaid over a long time period, 20, 30, 40 years. But the really unique characteristic of PACE finance is the fact that the funding is linked to the property. Now, this comes back to something Jessica mentioned earlier, which is the fact that payback periods on some energy efficiency measures can deter investment. Now, if the financing is linked to the property, that deterrent goes away, because when you move property, you will not be taking the financing for those energy efficiency measures with you. Whoever moves into the property and benefits from those energy efficiency measures is the one who is also repaying. So we're doing a lot of work at the Institute to understand the legal and financial mechanisms for introducing this, and we'll be publishing a report next month outlining some really interesting results from some consumer research we did. Now, we've also touched on the dialogue and the link between landlords and tenants. And this is where we've seen, again, abroad, the success of green rental agreements. Now, we know that green leases have been on the scene for quite a while, but green rental agreements take this one step further, and they encourage a distribution of the economic benefits from a retrofit between the landlord and the tenant. And a template for this model of rental agreement will be coming out soon, initially focused at the residential sector, but with obviously significant overlaps to the commercial space. Now, the final solution I'll mention today, which isn't a pure financial solution, but this comes into what Melanie was talking about around the need for collaboration. And I would add to that and say that we need cross-sector collaboration. We cannot work in silos anymore to tackle climate change. Finance needs to work with the property sector, energy companies, government, local and national, and NGOs. And this is where building renovation passports are so important. Building renovation passports are digital tools that provide a granular view on how a property is performing today and a step-by-step roadmap of how you can decarbonise that property, with links into the supply chain and links into the finance. Now, again, these have been quite successful in Europe, and the Green Finance Institute is soon to launch a framework for how or what best practice looks like in terms of building renovation passports in the UK. And there are some really innovative programs developing these kind of tools, including the Optimised Retrofit project that's being funded by the Welsh Government. So last little bit I'll mention, I know there was a question around how do you fund energy efficient buildings? I think there's something around looking deeper, more deeply into the link between energy efficiency, climate resiliency, let's not forget that angle as well, particularly with today's report from the UK Committee on Climate Change, and the link with valuation. Now, if we're able to start building in and demonstrating that link between more energy efficient and resilient properties and an uplift in property values, that can actually help support, developers being able to still achieve attractive returns while investing slightly more to deliver a much more energy efficient property. So I think I'll close on that, and I'll hand back to you, Sonal.
Thank you, Emma. Really useful. Clearly, the message there is everyone stay tuned to Green Finance Institute's website. Lots of initiatives in the planning with PACE finance, passports, and obviously green rental agreements, in addition to the green mortgage work. Amazing. I might just come back to you for a little bit deeper insight into the way I understood all of this is probably all private finance initiatives. Now, what is the role of public-private finance in this space?
It's a really important question. And Melanie mentioned earlier about some of the failings that we saw in the Green Homes grant scheme. And I think there is a very critical role for public finance in actually being used to leverage in private capital. So grants have a place for supporting fuel poor, and a sort of sector deal proposal was put out by E3G today, talking about the need for grants to support those kind of households. But you can leverage in significant amounts of private capital by using small amounts of public finance as cornerstone investment or by providing guarantees. And we really hope that the UK Infrastructure Bank provides some of these facilities in the space. And then that helps de-risk transactions. And therefore, private investors feel more comfortable to come into deals that maybe at this stage in the market's growth are not attractive, or there are significant technological risks. This kind of capital that can be used to de-risk these transactions, if provided by the public sector, can really help spur the market. And then it can taper off later on. The perfect example to look at in this scenario is the offshore wind sector, which was a perfect case study of how public finance can help bring in and create a new private finance market.
Great, thank you. So the role of public finance to de-risk, very interesting. If I might just take a moment to remind the audience, if you have any burning question, tricky question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function while we carry on. One of the things that's playing in my head is, there's lots of great work happening in your case, for example, the new solutions being developed from financing perspective. Melanie, I think what it will be really helpful to understand, actually both Melanie and Ian, from your perspective, how do we take this to the market? And some of the points you were making about the change we want to see in mindset and their openness and willingness to try new things. How can we ensure this doesn't become failures of the Green Home grants are attributed to multiple reasons, but also the fact about how we ensure there is enough uptake of these and the market is benefiting from these.
I'm happy to go first. So I think you need to partly turn the question on its head and say the market is taking it to us actually as developers and as asset owners. Increasingly, not only are investors and lenders demanding that we face up into these challenges, but actually the people who use our buildings are expecting higher standards. And I think, actually COVID may have, and recovery from COVID may have an accelerating driver on that, because, as whatever the future of, office working ultimately looks like, and I think the jury's absolutely out on that. But, what is clear is that people are going to want to have reasons to go into an office, at least in the short term, and that's going to be about healthier buildings. That's going to be about buildings that meet higher standards and their expectations. And we already know that younger people in particular coming into the workforce, they're demanding more of their employers. They want to work for businesses they believe have the right moral compass, and that absolutely includes net zero very, very high on that list. So I think the market is doing to us. How we can reverse that and then say, well, how do we create more momentum to take advantage of the opportunities that are being made available, whether it's government funding or more likely actually private sector incentives and funding or partnership funding. I think, again, people will need to look for those opportunities and they will need to find them if they're going to have sustainable businesses and deliver sustainable outcomes. So I think there's a momentum that's growing. We're still quite early stages of that in some cases, but I think there is an inescapable momentum building. And what's been fantastic, I think, over the last year, by contrast with 2008 and the global finance crisis, is that sustainability and net zero in particular, has not dropped down people's agendas, whereas it did in 2008. At this time, people have been really focused throughout on saying, we're not parking that because it's too difficult because we've got to manage all these other short-term crises. It still has to be at the heart of what we're doing now, and it has to be at the heart of our recovery programme to rebuild out of COVID. So I'm quite optimistic on that front, actually.
Brilliant.
Yeah, And I'd pick up and definitely agree with Melanie. I think the market is driving this at the moment, and I think that's as it should be, which is really good. And what that means for government, and Historic England is government, just like to make that clear, is that we need to listen much more closely to what the market is telling us and respond accordingly. So, for example, from a Historic England perspective, we've had a very, very strong message around the need for clearer guidance and advice. That there's not enough clarity in terms of and guidance for particularly for homeowners, but also for the commercial sector. So we're looking at that at the moment. We're trying to address where there are problems, and the work that we're doing with Grosvenor and others are giving us a really good insight as to where the challenges are and therefore what we need to do. And I think that applies to the whole of government, really, to understand what can the market do for itself, listen to it, but where does it therefore need to take action to support the market in its attempt to address these challenges.
Sonal, just to come back in and build on that, I mean, there's also, I think, a really important role for government as an exemplar. The government has a massive built environment estate, and actually what they can do both by example on their own estate and, driving contractor powerful. And I know that government, talking to Janet Young and others in government, I know they're well aware of that and determined to set that example. But I think that's really important too. Absolutely. Great points here, but also I love the optimism in market driving the momentum forward. We have a slightly financial question. I'm going to read it out, but I'll probably let the panel volunteer, depending on who's best suited to answer. It's from a developer's point of view. Say residential buildings require a brown 3.75% yield. What is the green yield and what will it be? I guess the way I'm understanding is, yes, there might be risk of obsolescence and brown discount, but for those who move early, what's the view on the potential to capitalize on a green yield or premium?
I'm happy to sort of add a slightly wider comment on that. Sadly, I can't put a number on what the yield would be, but what we've seen in the finance sector is, for instance, in the green bond market, we've sometimes seen bonds price slightly within what the non-green equivalent would have been. That's predominantly driven by demand for green investments. One of the key things that we've seen as well in success and scale up of green activities is actually they need to still be commercially viable for everybody involved. So green finance products, they may offer a slight discount in interest rates, but that's often because the bank is assessing that those assets are lower risk, in particular over the long term. So there's something around still being able to ensure that investments are commercial. But I think if you have a look at some of these, green properties that are being developed, there's, we did research when I was at Barclays, we've seen the Bank of England come out subsequently, and these results are replicated in other countries, is that the repayments or the default rates on financing for energy efficient properties, there are significantly lower default rates and probability of default on lending to greener properties. There is long-term protection of property values, so there's going to be less requirement to retrofit and upgrade those properties down the line. So I think sometimes it's around expanding the time horizon of when those returns are going to be coming in. And then seeing that actually, yes, you are benefiting from, to use your words, lower obsolescence, better tenancy and occupancy rates, etc. That's sort of more the finance sector's perspective on green and yields.
I'll just add to that. So that's absolutely spot on, Emma. And I think just from I've got a background and sort of prior to working at Fiera Real Estate, also worked at MSCI Real Estate. And I think for a very long time, this was 10 years ago now, but for a very long time, the market has been trying to find this sort of perceived green premium and understand, what is it? And it's really tricky to kind of look at it in isolation because there's so many investment drivers that are sort of contributing to an asset's performance. I think the point I always sort of come back to is that rather than sort of, talking about a green premium and things like that, is that what we need to be conscious of is that there's most likely just going to be a brown discount in the future, in that even though properties might, for example, looking at our development side of the business, looking at, doing net zero carbon construction, for example, it might deliver a sort of a higher cost initially because of the amount of renewable energy that you have to install, etc. But when you look at that in the future and in terms of carbon pricing and the tax that you have to consider going forward, and the potential that your asset could become stranded at some point in the future, you might not be able to attract a good tenant, all those sort of things. You're talking about default rates, Emma. I think you just need to consider that in sort of the bigger picture. So whilst there might be maybe a slightly higher cost to construct a net zero carbon building now, or retrofit, or whatever it might be, in the long term, that elusive green premium is ultimately there, because at the end of the day, it's almost the risk of, it's that transition risk. It's the risk of not doing something that's actually more important than any perceived green premium. I think that we just need to be conscious of that going forward, because I think that's ultimately where we're going to end up. So I just wanted to add that now.
Absolutely. I mean, I completely concur. It's really every market, every property type, commercial, residential, is so unique that it's hard to generalize premiums. The report that Oliver mentioned, JLL published last year, looked at key markets within central London only offices, and we tried to control for various factors so we can try and isolate what the premium would be. What we found was, after controlling for various factors, even height of buildings, sublocation, most sustainable properties in the last 3 to 5 years did command a premium of up to 10% in rental premium. Now, I say this while also caveating that our view is this will change, because some of it is also as a result of this supply-demand gap. You look at central London, you want to occupy a net zero buildings, there aren't many. So obviously this skews the market a little bit, but yes, it's hard to kind of quantitatively put that figure on unless you're taking, and absolutely the point to take the wider view and the long-term view and looking at all factors associated. We have another question from the audience, which again, I think it's basically almost going back to that point about retrofitting and the onus and responsibility of landlords, which seems a bit unfair because benefits accrue to tenants. Obviously, with initiatives such as SPACE, these things, or green rental agreements, these may change. But at the moment, how does panel see this conundrum being solved outside of government regulation? So I might just kind of open the floor. This probably will be our last question. So how can we untangle this split incentive within our sector?
I mean, I would challenge back and say, yes, whilst retrofitting will mean that the occupier pays less, longer term, I'm pretty confident you'll see the value return on making that investment, and you'll see that in a few different ways. One is, in terms of the whole building, you'll be able to reduce life cycle costs, maintenance costs associated. You'll be able to attract those premium tenants, the higher rents, and then longer term, if you can demonstrate transparently back to the marketplace that you're able to hit certain KPIs, you can get access to cheaper debt, and you will likely get more investment and higher exit yield. And I think where we've looked at the neighbours rating in Australia, which we're looking to incorporate now in Europe, there's been a lot of links there between higher capital value and improved energy performance, and has really taken off for landlords. I think one interesting angle that I have heard recently was that to try and overcome this challenge that the tenants are taking the savings, you might in the future say, okay, well, let's create a bucket amount that you will pay, and we're going to try really hard together to be able to reduce energy spend in a building. And anything we do take, we're going to reinvest that money straight back into the asset. So actually, rather than losing those energy savings as a landlord, you look to work on those and just continue to improve the asset as you show those proof of concept. So yeah, a few angles there. I hope that makes sense.
Certainly, absolutely. I think it brings us to that point that the narrative has to be a shared goal-led, and also fair point around, your driver to retrofitting is not just energy cost savings. It's the wider value drivers. With that, I think I would like to bring us to our closing question for the panel. And if I can ask each of the panelists to take no more than 30 seconds to comment on this following question, which is, do you think that the real estate sector can achieve net zero carbon by 2050? And if yes, what would be your one key recommendation for the audience to take on board? So I'll start with Jessica, you first.
The jury's still out on that one. Can we achieve net zero by 2050? I'm not sure. I'm going to be an optimistic yes, but obviously, I think a lot of urgent action is required. And I guess my ask then would be that take the steps needed to understand how to address net zero carbon within your portfolio, the assets you manage, whatever whether you're developing. Understand what is required. Don't stand still and wait, for everything to kind of fall into place. We need to start now and look to the industry, collaborate, work together to try solve this together, really. I think that would be my key ask. Great,
thank you. Ian, over to you next.
Yeah, thank you. It's a qualified yes from me, with the right kind of support from government, I think, and that relies on collaboration. So I think it is possible. It's very achievable, but it needs to be done in a collaborative way, I think, as all of the speakers have said, all the panelists have said. In terms of the one piece of advice I'd give to the real estate sector is take the right decision, not the easy decision. Because in the long run, if you run towards a simple solution that might not be the right solution, you might end up with longer term costs and longer term emissions. So do the right thing rather than the easy thing.
Brilliant. Emma, over to you.
So, eternal optimist, and I'm going to say yes, particularly because the UK Committee on Climate Change in their 6th carbon budget have given a realistic analysis that does get us to net zero. But to use their sort of phrases, we do need to act now. We need to embrace the place-based transition approach. Let's be sympathetic to communities and to areas. But I really love what Ian just said now. Don't take the easy path, take the right path.
Great, that's good. Melanie?
Another qualified yes. I think I've already sort of shared my general sense of optimism. I think, the best of the industry, the most advanced of the industry, are publishing plans that are credible and show that how it can be done. The challenge is to get that disseminated more widely, to build that sense of momentum across the industry as a whole. There are things that, there are externalities, so I think we can achieve it by doing the things that we can do within our control if we take the right decisions, to other panelists' points, but that also relies on, the continued decarbonisation of our electricity supply and other things that are outside the industry's direct control. It does depend, I think, to some extent on bringing our tenants and occupiers with us so that behaviours match the aspirations that we have for the way that our buildings are used. So there are all sorts of things that need to happen, but I think we can see that people are producing evidence that it's possible.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. And Oliver?
Yeah, I'm going to have to say yes as well. I'm optimistic. I think I really liked all those points being made. I think one other point I would add is around innovation. I just see a lot of innovation up to 2050 and collaboration around what you can do with certain types of assets or certain types of technology. And I think my recommendation would be just define your ambition. When do you want to be net zero? Do you want to be net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050? And once you start to understand that and start to build targets around it, you really then understand what's required and who you need to get buy-in from. So yeah, I just really try and define your ambition as soon as you can.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for such brilliant views. What is so pleasing is it seems to be a resounding yes. So everyone agrees that our sector can achieve net zero carbon by 2050. And I think in terms of how, some of the great points you've made is define your ambition. Let's start now to understand what it takes. Let's take the right decision, not the easy solutions. Point around collaboration has come out very, very strongly in today's discussion. And obviously, let's not wait. Let's just start in terms of what is under our control. Let's just at least start with that for those who aren't as progressed. So absolutely, it feels like we have really shifted the narrative from commitment, from rhetoric to let's just start now from wherever we can. Every little step will count. Brilliant. So with that, as I draw us to a close, a very big thank you to our panelists for joining us today, sharing your insights on how our sector can transition to net zero carbon, and all our audience participants who signed on and participated in the discussion. Hope you found the insights useful, and will use that to inform your own net zero plans and actions that you plan to take forward. With that, I'll now hand over to the Real Estate Live team to give an overview of what's coming next. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonal, and thank you very much to our panel for a really great discussion. It covered a lot of different angles on the topic and gave some really clear recommendations for the next steps in the journey. Hopefully everyone's come away with a sense of urgency as well as hope. And thank you to Fiera Real Estate UK for your support of the panel. Looking ahead, audience, we'd be delighted to see you tuning in to some of our other sessions today. Details of what's coming up next are going to be appearing on your screen. We have Ealing's green print for High Street Recovery at 11 a.m. We have a session on regional collaboration and the Cambridge-Norwich Tech Corridor with Norfolk and Suffolk Unlimited. We have a session about Hammersmith's exciting public realm proposals, which are all tied to a greener town centre. So sticking with the green theme for today, and continuing that, we have our half-hour lunchtime talk with Jason Longhurst, who's the chair and CEO of the UK BCSD, and that's the Building Council for Sustainable Development. And finally, at 2 p.m, we have our Redefining Town Centres keynote. So lots coming up. Hopefully, we'll see you at some of those. Thank you for joining our Green Investment keynote, and we'll look forward to seeing you again either later today or later in the week.